Welcome, everyone.
Welcome.
Thank you. Sound louder so the microphone picks it up on the camera. There we are. So nice to see such a large crowd here tonight at Beaufort County Library main branch. I'm Jonathan Huck, director of the Pat Conroy Literary Center. And before we begin tonight's program and actually focus on what we're doing here, I want to just quickly remind everyone of another event that's happening somewhere else starting tomorrow. The second annual Bluffton Book Festival is tomorrow, beginning at that library, the Bluffton Branch Library, tomorrow afternoon at 3:30, and then going on through Saturday. And we have information about that festival in the back of the room. Not only that, we have one of the authors who's presenting at the Bluffton Book Festival, Miho Keenis, with us in the audience. All right, but let's get to tonight then. On behalf of the Pat Conroy Literary Center and the Beaufort County Library System, I want to welcome you all to another presentation in our 5-book Carolina on My Mind discussion series. This program and the whole series is sponsored by South Carolina Humanities, a nonprofit organization inspiring, enriching, and engaging South Carolinians with programs on literature, history, culture, and heritage. Each free public event in this series features a different visiting scholar or discussion leader presenting on a book representative of the larger South Carolina experience, and copies of all of those books are available for circulation through the library and on the back table here tonight. In our third program in this series, tonight we welcome historian David L. Preston discussing the 2001 book, Partisans and Redcoats, the Southern conflict that turned the tide of the American Revolution. It was the 10th book written by our state's preeminent historian, Walter Edgar. And our presenter, David L. Preston, as I mentioned to him just minutes ago, has a short bio that is 90% book awards that he has won. He is by far our most award-winning presenter in this series so far. Preston has been called one of the most gifted young historians working today by his fellow historian David Hackett Fisher. He is the West Vaco Professor of National Security Studies at the Citadel. His first book, The Texture of Contact, European and Indian Settler Communities on the Frontier of Iroquois, won the 2010 Albert B. Corey Prize from the American Historical Association and the Canadian Historical Association. But he was really just getting started with that, because his second book, Braddock's Defeat, was named winner of the 2015 Guggenheim Lerman Prize in Military History, the 2016 Distinguished Book Award in U.S. History of the Society of Military History, the 2016 Prose Award for U.S. History from the Association of American Booksellers, the 2016 Distinguished Book Award of the Society for Colonial Wars, I'm not done, and the 2016 Judge Robert Waltz History Award of the French and Indian War Foundation, and it was a finalist for the 2016 George Washington Book Prize. So, on the basis of that resume, I really want to hear you applaud when we welcome Professor David L. Preston.
Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well, and I want to thank Jonathan Haupt and the Pat Conroy Literary Center for the very kind invitation to be with you tonight. Being from the Citadel, I have a natural affinity for Pat Conroy, of course. So I'm doubly delighted to be here, and especially in Beaufort, one of my favorite places in South Carolina. So a treat for me all around. So this evening we're going to talk about and discuss a wonderful book on the American Revolution in South Carolina, very influential in the field, by one of our state's leading historians, of course, Walter Edgar. The book Partisans and Redcoats was, just by way of a personal example, was one that I read when I came to the Citadel 14 years ago, and I knew that that being the early American military historian at the Citadel, that I was going to become a historian of the Southern campaigns of the American Revolution, whether I liked it or not. So this was one of the first books that I read, and it was very timely, coming out in the early 2000s. And if I had to describe its significance for both myself as well as other historians, I would say that it kind of crystallized a major development in our understanding of the American Revolution. Name for me some battles, famous battles of the Revolutionary War. Okay, and not necessarily outside of South Carolina. Just Kings Mountain, good. Yorktown. How about up north and Yankee Land? Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, Breeds Hill, very good. Saratoga. For a long time, the northern campaigns of the war got the lion's share of attention. Why do you think that's the case? Like, why were some of these northern battles the ones that were most memorialized and remembered?
Boston Spirit.
Okay.
The aura of Boston.
The aura of Boston. Okay.
That's the main reason.
Okay. Yes, sir.
You know, Walter Edwards recently floated around that there was a revision of American Revolution history following the Civil War.
Okay. Even before that, though, there's a fellow named George Washington that has something to do with this, and the fact that Washington and his campaigns were in the northern colonies or the middle colonies meant that historians were more often than not focused on those regions. As a result, a lot of historians up until recently, say the last 30 years, have tended to neglect the southern campaigns and the real significance of those campaigns. Today, many Revolutionary War historians would argue that the southern campaigns that began here in 1778, 79, 80, 81 were really the decisive moments of the Revolutionary War that resulted in American victory and British defeat. So that is why this book is so important. And the other truth that Edgar's book gets is the really gritty nature of the war in the Carolinas. Much more so than the Revolution in, say, Massachusetts or New York. This was truly a vicious civil war among Americans. And this is, of course, long before, decades before, the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. So Edgar's book helps us, it recaptures this element of the Revolution as a civil war that divided Americans into patriot and loyalist factions. And a lot of what he argues in this book is that the really vicious nature of the war, this kind of Hobbesian, brutal struggle, it was a result of those types of tensions among Americans who were fighting against fellow Americans. What I'd like to do is provide some brief remarks on Edgar's book and kind of the trajectory it takes. But I also want to go beyond what his book does. He focuses on a particular period in the American Revolution. He mainly focuses on the year of 1780, particularly the summer and the fall of 1780. And this is a short book. It doesn't go much further beyond that into the year 1781 and 82. So I want to carry his story forward and show again how incredibly important and indeed decisive the Southern campaigns really were. So that's, I think, one of the big takeaways that I want us all to leave here with is a real sense that this is in many ways the cockpit of the American Revolution where it really comes to an end. And again, it results in American victory and British defeat. So let's start with just a little bit of background. Somebody tell me how the flag of South Carolina relates to the American Revolution. And I've given you a big hint up here on the screen.
Well, the Preston, of course, was the badge on the military's urine pat, and palmetto tree with the laws of the military itself. Color blue, I suppose, represents fidelity. That's it.
That's right. So our state flag today is it harkens back to these powerful emblems of American liberty. The British first attempted to take Charlestown, as it was then called, in the year 1776, and this attempt met with disaster. There are two important things that come out of this. Number one, by turning back the British Expeditionary Force, the Patriots, of course, secured a great victory. They solidified their own control of the colony, but they also, in defeating the Royal Navy, they really deflected one of the Loyalists' most important objections to the idea of even pursuing independence, let alone a war against Britain. Many Loyalists said there is no way that we can ever hope to defeat Britain because of their naval supremacy. And here in the second year of the fighting, what do the Patriots do? They defeat the Royal Navy at Fort Moultrie. So from 1776 until the year 1778, there are no major British field armies or expeditionary forces in the southern colonies. Why do they come back beginning in late 1778? Does anybody know?
And split the colonies.
Okay.
And harm the war effort.
Okay. This does have the effect if they shift forces down to the southern colonies, it can potentially divert American forces. That's very good. Anybody else? Exactly. And that is really 9/10 of the reason why the British decide to shift their strategy, the focal point of their military operations to the southern colonies. Again, this happens late in 1778. And they do believe that if they come here, that the Loyalists can be an integral part of their efforts to reoccupy and pacify and restore royal government in the southern colonies. Why did the British believe that there were so many Loyalists here? Well, that goes back to, in many ways, the time period of 1775 and 6, when royal governors who were still here were writing dispatches back to London or to local British military commanders, and they're saying, if you just show up on our coast with an army and a fleet and you're able to support us, the loyal population will rise up and support you. And this is a really important point to understand, because one of the most important strategic and political miscalculations that the British make throughout this conflict is their overestimation of loyalist strength and sentiment. Especially early in the war, British policymakers in London, they don't quite understand that this is a popular revolution. They think that the revolutionaries are simply a small faction of people who have distorted the otherwise profound loyalty of the colonists. And so wherever the British go in this conflict, they generally want or think that they are going to attract large numbers of loyalists. And it never quite pans out for them. So, for example, when the British leave Boston in 1776, they shift their operations southward to New York City in that area. And they campaign there for a few years. Again, expecting large loyalist support in the form of militia, in the form of political support. And that doesn't quite pan out for them. And it leads to catastrophes like the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. And that, of course, leads to the French intervening in the war in the year 1778. So when the British shift their operations southward here to the Carolinas and Georgia, beginning in 1778, in many respects, this is their last major effort to achieve outright military victory. And it's important to understand that this is where the British make their final effort to win the war militarily. And of all the areas in the 13 colonies, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina did indeed have some of the largest concentrations of loyalists. And again, that is what Edgar's book does so well, is it recaptures that this was a truly divided population. Do you all recall, by chance, what John Adams said about the population? He said that they were generally 1/3 patriot, 1/3 loyalist, and 1/3 neutral, meaning there was a section of the population that really didn't care one way or another who won. They just wanted to be left alone with their farms and their properties undamaged by marauding armies. That's really, I think that ratio is pretty true to form in many sections of the southern colonies. So in December of 1778, the British will indeed commence this southern strategy. And in December of 1778, the British do what they do best. One of their greatest advantages militarily is their skill at amphibious warfare. They are the masters of amphibious warfare in the 18th century. The British Royal Navy controls the waters. They have adequate landing craft, and they can park a large field army wherever they choose, essentially. This is an interesting point that Edgar references in the book, that the British generally are able to capture urban centers like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Savannah, which they capture in late 1778. As many of you might know, they temporarily occupied Beaufort in 1779. They capture Charlestown in a stunningly successful military operation in 1780. But here is one of the problems that we're going to see developing. And Edgar's book is so important on this score. Edgar's book shows in microcosm why the British were unable to produce strategic and political gains from these incredible military victories. Here's the rub. The British could control seaports, they could control cities, but they could never control the countryside. And therefore, they could never restore large sections of the colonies back under royal governance. And if they don't do that, that means patriots are still controlling the majority of the land and the people. Okay, 1780 is really where Edgar's book picks off, and he focuses on the dominance of the British coming into the Carolinas as they implement this Southern strategy. And he focuses in particular on the two leading commanders at this point in the war. On the left here is Sir Henry Clinton. He was the overall commander-in-chief of British forces in America, beginning in 1778. And on his right is an individual who's well known to us, Lord Charles Cornwallis, who was essentially Clinton's, you might call him today, his executive officer or his operational commander. These two individuals will lead a massive armada, numbering well over 10,000 troops and sailors and Marines in this massive expedition from New York City, and they arrive off the coast of Charlestown in early 1780. And so commences the siege of Charlestown. And this again highlights the strengths of the British in using those naval forces as well as their overall numerical superiority to outmaneuver the American defenders. In this case, the American defenders were commanded by Major General Benjamin Lincoln. He was a Continental Army commander, and he was essentially a loser for sure in this action. He commanded an army of nearly 6,000. That was the Southern Continental Army in essence. We often lose sight of the fact that there were multiple Continental Armies in different departments. So Lincoln commanded the Southern Continental Army in what was called the Southern Department, kind of like a military district. Well, the rub here is that the British are able to outmaneuver, they besiege Charleston, and they force the surrender of the entire Southern Continental Army. This was the kind of stroke that the British had been aiming for since the beginning of the war. The destruction of an entire field army. If the British had been able to do that to Washington back in 1776, the war probably would have ended then. So the British had ample reason to believe that a victory of this magnitude, you've just knocked out your opponent's entire army, that there will be a fairly easy movement into the countryside to occupy it, and then again to pacify the countryside, restore civilian control of the royal government, put the hands of power, put power back into the hands of your loyalist allies that you're expecting to rise up, right? And you've got the foundation for, again, something larger. The other colonies to the north now might have an alternative to Patriot control. So here's what Clinton says following the defeat of the Americans at Charlestown. He says, "I hope I am not too sanguine when I say that both the Carolinas are conquered in Charlestown." Think about what he said there. Both the Carolinas are conquered in Charlestown. And who was going to oppose them? When again, the Southern Continental Army has just been knocked out of commission. Here again is the heart of Walter Edgar's book. And what he does so beautifully is to show how the struggle for American independence, the fight against the British, devolved upon essentially ordinary citizens. Militia, or as he terms them here in the title of his book, partisans. I have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah. And this is probably going to take you off Australia a little bit.
That's fine. I want to hear your question.
What happens to the 6,000 soldiers? Where are they? Are they held in prisons in Charleston? Are they on prison ships? Are they prison ships?
Well, you're not diverting me at all, because you're bringing me back to another one of Edgar's key points. Traditionally in 18th century warfare, the troops that were, like, especially in like a mass surrender like this, there was always some type of convention or some type of legal agreement between the two armies governing what was going to happen to the surrender to the vanquished army.
This is a rebellion.
True. And so, interestingly enough, what the British do initially is that they parole the Americans. And so that means that they are allowed to return to their homes, with the understanding, upon 18th century ideas of honor, that they would not take up arms against the British again. And this honestly played into British ideas about trying to win loyalty, right? And win people to accept the restoration of British government. It was actually a very good move. Instead of treating them like traitors that could have been, tried for that crime.
I just know in the northern theater that doesn't happen. Often you're treated as traitors from the prisons in New York.
That's true. The prison hulks. That's very true. So there's not necessarily consistency on the part of the British in terms of policy. If you want to read an outstanding book on the issue of prisoners in the war, I highly recommend a recent book by Carl Bowrick, who is the director of the Charleston Museum. He has a wonderful book that looks at these ideas of prisoner exchange. Remember too that the British 18th century armies really couldn't be saddled logistically with having to house and feed and maintain 6,000 soldiers. So there were also supply reasons why you would parole them.
I was going to ask you, what was the incidence of parole versus imprisonment in the war?
That's a good question. I would say that the weight of the evidence tends towards paroling prisoners rather than keeping them as...
What about exchange? Did they ever exchange them?
They did. Here's the most famous exchange of the war. When the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781 and they capture Lord Cornwallis, he is exchanged for none other than Henry Lawrence of South Carolina, who at one time had been the president of the Continental Congress, and he was actually imprisoned in England. So they were exchanged on a one-to-one basis. So everything seems to be looking good for the British at this point in the war. Yes.
Cornwallis circulate petition
Yes, that was part of the parole as well. And part of the idea of honor is that parolees were often enjoined to do something like that. That they would lay down their arms, return to their homes, and pledge not to fight again. So, to get back to our story here, here's essentially what the British are doing in the summer of 1780. Is that they are fanning out into the countryside, and they are establishing points and garrisons, fortifications, and it's very instructive that this is the first time in the war that the British have attempted to occupy and hold such a huge swath of territory. A close second is in the late fall of 1776, after Washington's army had been defeated time and time again around New York City. The British did try to occupy much of New Jersey, but Georgia and South Carolina are not New Jersey. This is a huge undertaking. And essentially the British perimeter, it kind of stretches from Savannah up to Augusta into the back country or the up country of Carolina, and extending back down to Charleston via posts like 96, Winnsboro, Camden, Fort Watson, and back to Charlestown. It's kind of a U-shaped perimeter in many ways. So at this point, things are looking good for the British. However, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia was not about to allow the British to reconquer these colonies unchecked. So after the defeat in Charlestown, the Continental Congress will send additional reinforcements southward, Continental Army regiments, and they are commanded by one of the great heroes of the war at this point, Major General Horatio Gates. Remember, Gates was the victor of the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 that resulted in the French entering the war in alliance with the United States. So this was an important political move and military move on the part of the Congress, in that it demonstrated to the citizens of the Carolinas and Georgia that they would not be abandoned by the rest of the country. And to that extent, the approach of Horatio Gates's army, coming from Virginia into North Carolina, was something that helped to buttress Patriot resistance and morale. However, Gates, at the Battle of Camden in August of 1780, attempts to attack a smaller portion of Cornwallis's force, and it results in, again, one of the greatest military catastrophes of the entire war for the Americans. Gates's army numbered roughly about 3,000 combatants, and here are the grim odds of the Battle of Camden that lasted a few hours. So, about 1/3 of the army, plus or minus 1,000 men, will be killed or wounded in the action. Another 1/3 of the army is captured, and then the remaining third is flying on their heels seeking refuge. So here again is an example of British battlefield might. They were outnumbered slightly, but these British regulars just seemed to dominate every conventional force that opposes them. So after the Battle of Camden, again, the British felt they've knocked out another Continental Army. And it's in this period, in July and August of 1780, into the fall of 1780, that compromises the heart of Edgar's book. And what he shows is how partisan actions began to stymie British efforts to win victory in South Carolina. So he shows us a different kind of war, a war in which a battle involving, say, a few hundred men is ultimately more important strategically, militarily, and politically than a large battle like Camden or the siege of Charlestown involving thousands. Can you think of any wars in history that have that type of dynamic, where small actions seem to outweigh the largest actions or victories? Vietnam.
Yeah.
Or even in Iraq and Afghanistan. Look at how small ambushes where Iraqi insurgents might happen to destroy or knock out an M1 Abrams tank. Even though they lose the battle and they get decimated in the process, it's seen as this kind of moral victory, right? A political victory. So one of the battles that Edgar especially highlights is a battle called Huck's defeat in 1780. I think I have a picture of that here. Yeah. This battle illustrates so many of the dynamics of the conflict in the South Carolina backcountry. Number one, let's think about this. Here's the population dynamics of the colony of South Carolina. Where do most African slaves live in 1780? If you had to. Along the coast, exactly. Why? The rice culture, rice plantations. So the majority of the population was African, and it was concentrated largely in the Low Country. The vast majority of the white population was concentrated in the upcountry, or the back country as it was called in the 18th century. So as a military dynamic, think about that. As the British advance further into the interior, they are advancing more deeply into the population that might very well oppose them in arms. And so that is why, in part, the back country, rather than the low country, emerges as the area where so much of this combat unfolds. And again, it's local citizens, militia bands. Honestly, sometimes these partisan units are organized around family or kin groups or neighborhoods, and they are determined to resist British rule. Another point that Edgar raises about the nature and the composition of the backcountry population is that that a good chunk of these settlers were Scots-Irish, who did not have a lot of affinity for Britain. They were Presbyterian, whereas the King's Church is Anglican. So that's an important military dynamic, just the very composition of the South Carolina population.
You can also be fought differently,
Yes.
like large mountain men, we fought Indian style.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's another important part of the background. The British, they, with hindsight, they should have recognized that this population had at least two recent wars involving the Cherokees. It's called the First Cherokee War, 1759 to 1761, and then more recently, a Cherokee War in 1776. And absolutely, a lot of these backcountry settlers imbibed a lot of the fighting methods and tactics of their Native American foes, who were ultimately the masters of warfare in this environment. So, the Battle of Huck's defeat, I say that most people have never heard of it unless they've happened to read Get Edgar's book or another volume on the war in South Carolina. This is a battle that involved about 400 people, on both sides. And yet, Edgar shows that this type of engagement was truly decisive. And it ultimately leads to the breakdown in the British war effort. So, the Battle of Huck's defeat also was a battle among Americans for the most part. The two forces arrayed here were patriot militias on the one hand, and a group of loyalists in different units that were commanded by an officer named Christian Huck. Most of the British at this battle were loyalists from the northern colonies. Christian Huck himself was from Pennsylvania. But these were Americans who were determined to uphold the rule of their king. One of the dynamics that Edgar draws out is that as these patriot and loyalist factions fought against each other, they often did so in very vicious ways. Especially local South Carolina loyalists who had kind of been under the domination of patriots for many years by this point. When the British Army finally shows up, they see this as an opportunity to exact vengeance on their patriot neighbors. And they often do so, often in brutal ways. And the loyalists in Christian Huck's command also gained a reputation for brutality, for being heavy-handed on the local population. And so they became a hated as well as a feared and also a kind of symbolic unit that kind of attracted fighters. And in this case, in July of 1780, patriots got superior intelligence of Huck's whereabouts and the fact that his command was not really well secured at their encampment at a place called Williamson's Plantation. There's actually a small historical park in the upstate today called Historic Brattonsville that preserves the site of Huck's defeat. I encourage you to visit that if you ever are up that way. So the Patriots were able to surround and attack Huck's command, and they destroy most of his command. They kill, wound, or imprison most of his command. Huck himself is killed by a bullet to the head. And these are the kinds of victories that become symbolic. They are important in terms of morale. And what this battle demonstrated to patriot militias was that the British could be defeated. These were British provincial troops, regulars, if you want to call them that, And they were among the best and most effective fighters in the British Army in South Carolina. And they had been defeated by, again, untrained militia or partisans. So Edgar's book ultimately carries the story forward by showing how, this is a map from his book, and notice that this only covers the months from July of 1780 into January of 1781. And it highlights the number of partisan actions that are exploding all across the backcountry of South Carolina. This is a type of war for which the British are not trained or equipped. They do not have the manpower to be able to control the countryside through force of numbers. And again, they do not train in the 18th century to fight against smaller bands of what we might term guerrillas today. And so it's an unexpected type of war. And the whole point of Edgar's book is how these partisan bands reverse the British gains that they had gotten in Savannah, in Charlestown, etc. Where does the story ultimately end? If we carry Edgar's story forward, what we find is that there is a combination of a new Continental Army and a continuation of this guerrilla warfare. And you all know the famous leaders here that emerged over the course of the conflict. Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Nathaniel Greene as the third commander and the victorious commander of the Continental Army. And he is the replacement for Horatio Gates. In the final analysis, Greene uses this combination of the regular army, the Continental Army, and the militia to destroy the British position in South Carolina. And in December of 1782, Greene and the Continental Army will enter Charlestown in triumph, liberating it from British control after over 2 years of occupation. The Southern campaigns not only set in motion that story of Greene's reconquest of the Southern colonies, but it also set in motion the eventual defeat of Lord Cornwallis. So one part of the story here is, to carry this forward, is in Cornwallis's campaigns through the Carolinas, he advances all the way into North Carolina in 1781. And Cornwallis's army is literally exhausted in these seemingly fruitless pursuits of Greene's army. They are exhausted by constant harassment from bands of militia. Detachments of the British Army get defeated at Cowpens, at Kings Mountain. And they are also exhausted in terms of supply, because it's very, very difficult for the British to sustain logistically an advance deep into the interior, because they're so far away from their naval supply lines. So, all that to say, in mid-1781, he elects to advance into Virginia to seek reinforcements as well as resupply. And he ends up at this place, this tiny little tobacco port called Yorktown. And that, in turn, allows the Northern Army of Washington, as well as Rochambeau, the French army commander, to descend upon him from New York, while a French fleet cuts off Cornwallis from the sea. And that leads to the surrender of Cornwallis's army. But all that to say that the process of British surrender, of their defeat, that process began here in the southern colonies. And that is perhaps the most important truth that Walter Edgar's book captures for us. I'd be happy to field any of your questions at this point, and any loose ends that we can tie. Okay? Thank you.
Percentages of the total patriot forces were actually trained continentals. I'm not talking about the militia, I'm talking, in other words, in a field army, special, as you're describing, was mixed militia.
Mm-hmm.
So what percentage was, you have the German general, I forget his name right now, but each one teach one. He would teach a squad, they would teach, train a regiment, they would go out and train another regiment.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they got the organized Continental Army. But what percentage were actually trained?
Okay, that's a wonderful question, and it really gets to the heart of the nature of the rebel. Yeah, von Steuben. But your question really gets us to the heart of why the Americans won the war. So the short answer to your question is that from our modern perspective, military perspective, the troops that were really trained were the Continentals. And the Continentals were essentially like America's regular army. So in addition to being regulars, they were also trained to be able to fight toe-to-toe with the British and win. The Continentals also were long-term soldiers. They were not short-termers in the sense that militia were, where the militia might turn out in the summertime because there's a invading British army in the vicinity, and then they fight some battle and then they go home. The militia, this is the way I like to say it, is that the Continental Army could not have won this war without the militia, because the militia are more numerous. They often have a kind of zeal about them. They're also willing to fight in larger battles, knowing that they have the Continentals there with them. At the same time, the militia could not have won this war without the backbone of the Continentals. Have you read by chance about the Battle of Cowpens?
Yes.
That is an excellent example of the kind of symbiotic relationship between militia and Continentals. Yeah.
I also read that the British had a high ground in Kingstown, but when they would fire with the mini balls, the balls would just roll out. They weren't as effective.
Yeah. Battle of Kings Mountain is very interesting. It's another example of Americans fighting Americans. The only person on that field who was a British soldier was the Loyalist commander, Major Ferguson. And you're correct that it was the Patriots, the militias had surrounded the Loyalists, who were up on top of this plateau on Kings Mountain, and yes, the Loyalists tended to overfire, shoot over the heads of the Patriots as they're aiming downhill. Right, and many of them were armed with rifles, and very, very accurate.
Well, one case where the high ground was not a good military position.
Exactly. Now, this also allows me to inject here that what do you think happens when a group of Loyalists, like at Kings Mountain, 1,000 of them, the entire Loyalist command there is killed, wounded, captured, or some of them, a few of them escape? How do you think a a victory like that for the Patriots is going to affect morale. Okay, so for the Patriots, it's going to heighten their morale. It might lead to more commitment to militia units. Conversely, it's going to really diminish loyalist morale. And those are the very dynamics that are ultimately important in this backcountry war. The hearts and minds of the local population.
Let me ask you a question on parole. The original condition of parole was that if you took it, you had to lay down your arms and not fight against the British. At some point, did the British change the term of parole so that you had to take an active role in their defense?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that because Henry Clinton, this is also one of the reasons why partisans in the summer of 1780 are again drawn into the fold, is that the British essentially renege on the original surrender terms granted at Charlestown in May of 1780. And your description is exactly right. The way that it's worded, it basically leaves one no choice except to either take up arms for the British or be considered an enemy of the state. And many Patriot parolees felt that was a violation of their original terms, and therefore they were released from the original obligation. But it does lead to some unfortunate incidents, like if you're from Charleston, or if you've read widely on the Revolution in South Carolina, you might know the name of Isaac Hayne. He was an unfortunate soul who was caught up in these legal terms and definitions over parole, and in his case, he was sadly executed, hanged, because of those what the British saw as a violation of those terms. Yes, ma'am.
What happened to these loyalists once the war was over?
Wonderful question. Wonderful question. So, it's quite fascinating that again, this war that was so vicious with, let me put it this way. War atrocities were committed on both sides. No one gets off looking lily white. And there's all sorts of terrible things that happened during the war. But despite its ferocity, one of the interesting things that happens after the war is that patriot South Carolinians, including the government of the revolutionary government of South Carolina, in the post-war years, they tend to reintegrate loyalists more or less seamlessly. It's really quite surprising, given, again, the scale of the brutality of the war. You would think that there would be more retribution against loyalists, but there's an excellent book, if you're interested, by a historian named Rebecca Brannon, and she has a nice short book that deals with this very question about the reintegration of loyalists back into society. And that's her argument, is that it was more or less pretty seamless and without a type of vengeful spirit.
Isn't a lot of those refugees from the Bahamas and Florida?
Yes.
Was that north of the
Most definitely. There were some loyalists who elected to leave South Carolina and relocate elsewhere in the British Empire. So that's certainly part of the story.
Any research on the number of those?
The number that sticks in my head, certainly we're talking into the tens of thousands here.
What's Canada?
Right. And also in those...
They didn't have a good lifestyle.
Some went to Canada, some went to Nova Scotia, some resettled in the West Indies. There's also, interestingly, a contingent of African loyalists, if you want to use that term, slaves who sought freedom in the British Army by fleeing to British lines. And this does become a dynamic in the war, in the southern colonies in particular, as the British, they obviously have this weapon in their arsenal that they can offer freedom to the slaves of rebel masters, not loyalist masters, but rebel masters, and sow the seeds of defeat that way in the Patriot ranks. And there are many Africans who will come into British lines and who will exit the colony with the British Army in December of 1782. Yes.
Follow up on a question I asked earlier. Recently, I was reading or listened to something about an idea that Dr. Ed has been floating around, using evidence such as the circulation of the William Sims books in the antebellum period, particularly those on Francis Marion, and various poems glorifying Southern theater patriot leaders, and then the disappearance of those from circulation and the writing out of history books at the time in the post-Civil War era as a Civil War era revision, trying to diminish the South's participation, contribution to the American Revolution. And again, I don't think he's actually written anything formally on this. I think it's something that's been floating around.
That's a very interesting hypothesis for sure. I don't think that if we're talking here about Southern historians, I don't think that Southern historians have ever abandoned their sense that the war in the Carolinas was hugely important.
More as a general overall narrative.
Like you mean like at a national level?
Yeah, on a national
okay.
level. Yeah.
Right. I guess that doesn't surprise me in the sense that historians have always emphasized, again from the early 19th century, the exploits of Washington and the battles that took place in the northern colonies. But I would be very curious to hear more about that idea, especially as it connects to essentially ideas of sectionalism. If in these national narratives that the southern part of the story is being written out, that'd be very interesting to learn about.
I found it interesting. Again, I don't think he's published anything concretely on that. It's something I've heard is still.
Okay. Excellent. One more question.
Well, I guess I'll ask about George Washington. Was it because of the strength of his personality, or why did this?
Why did people gravitate to him so much? It's partly that he commanded the largest component of the Continental Army, and indeed that he commanded and participated in some of the largest battles of the war, for sure. And he was ultimately the architect of American victory. So I think it's partly the force of his personality, the fact that he was the overall commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. But here is a man who is so utterly fascinating in his conduct of the war. He has unlike the British, Washington has an intuitive grasp of the nature of this war. He understands its dynamics far better than the British do. And that is why his choice of Nathaniel Greene to lead the Southern Army is so important, because Greene essentially carries Washington's strategy and methods southward with him. But an utterly fascinating individual who achieves the pinnacle of military power, and yet he has this incredible grasp of civil and military relations. So in 1783, when the war is finally over and a treaty is signed in which the British recognize America's independence, the Continental Army is disbanded. And Washington undertakes a very important, powerfully symbolic action. And he goes to the Continental Congress, which was then meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, and he delivers this incredibly moving address. In fact, when I read it to cadets at the Citadel, every time I usually shed a tear. It's very, very moving. But he surrenders back to the Congress the commission that he had accepted back in 1775 as general and as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. So he was essentially making the statement and solidifying a principle that he had lived by during his entire military career, that military power was subordinate to civilian authority. And yes, as you put it, the force of his personality and his example, it's something that cemented a principle that is thankfully with us today, that the military is subordinate to civilian authority. So that's a good note
I
to...
live outside of Maryland. That's where
Okay.
I'm from, and I go to the state capitol frequently and read that, and it's the same thing here.
Yeah,
It's colorful.
it is. And I think that's a good note to leave on. George Washington.